The autumn sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's hardware store in Cincinnati, Ohio. Pete rose, adjusted his worn baseball cap, and stepped out of his aged Ford pickup truck, the familiar creak of the door echoing in the quiet afternoon air. At 72, his movements carried the weight of decades spent sliding into home plate and chasing down fly balls. But there was still a determined spring in his step that spoke of the competitor he'd always been. The hardware store had become Pete's refuge over the past few years, not because he particularly enjoyed browsing through aisles of screws and paint cans, but because it was one of the few places in Cincinnati where he could exist without being constantly reminded of what he'd lost. The Hall of Fame, the respect, the legacy that should have been his crowning achievement. As he walked toward the entrance, Pete caught his reflection in the store's front window. The face staring back at him was weathered, marked by sun and stress, but the eyes still held that familiar fire that had made him Charlie Hustle during his playing days. His gray hair peeked out from under the red Cincinnati Reds cap that he wore everywhere, a symbol of both his greatest triumphs and his deepest regrets. The bell above Murphy's door chimed as Pete entered, and old Tom Murphy looked up from behind the counter with a genuine smile. Tom had been running this store for 35 years and had watched Pete's career unfold from the stands at Riverfront Stadium. More importantly, he'd also watched Pete's fall from grace without judgment. "Afternoon, Pete," Tom called out, his voice carrying the warm familiarity of an old friend. "Working on the deck again?" Pete nodded, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Carolyn's got me replacing some boards that are starting to rot. You know how it is, honey-do list never ends." Tom chuckled knowingly. "That's what keeps us married men honest. Head on back to lumber. Jerry just got a fresh shipment of treated pine in this morning." As Pete made his way through the store, he passed several other customers who glanced his way with varying expressions. Some offered polite nods of recognition, others whispered among themselves after he'd passed. He'd grown accustomed to being a curiosity, a living reminder of baseball's complicated relationship with its own history. The lumber section was quieter, filled with the rich scent of fresh-cut wood and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Pete ran his hand along several boards, checking for warping and measuring lengths with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent countless hours working with his hands during the off-seasons of his playing career. "Excuse me," a soft voice said behind him. Pete turned to see a young man, probably in his early 30s, standing awkwardly with his hands shoved deep in the pockets of a well-worn jacket. The stranger's dark hair was slightly tousled, and his brown eyes held a mixture of nervousness and determination that Pete recognized from his own playing days, the look of someone about to step up to the plate in a crucial situation. "You're Pete Rose, aren't you?" the young man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pete straightened slightly, preparing himself for whatever was coming. Over the years, he'd heard it all: accusations, disappointments, occasional praise, and frequent requests for autographs that he wasn't sure he deserved to give anymore. "Yeah, that's me," Pete replied cautiously, studying the stranger's face for any sign of hostility or judgment. The young man took a deep breath, and Pete could see his hands trembling slightly in his pockets. "My name is David Martinez. I've been looking for you for almost 2 years." Pete's eyebrows raised in surprise. This wasn't the typical encounter he'd grown accustomed to. There was something different about this David Martinez, something that made Pete's instincts, honed by decades of reading pitchers and opponents, tell him that this meeting was going to be significant. "Looking for me? What for?" Pete asked, his voice softer now, curiosity replacing wariness. David glanced around the lumber section nervously, as if making sure they were alone. The late afternoon light filtering through the store's skylights cast a warm glow over the stacks of wood, creating an almost intimate setting for their unexpected encounter. "It's about my father," David said, his voice gaining strength. "Miguel Martinez. He died 3 years ago. And before he passed, he told me a story about you. A story I think you need to hear." Pete felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times over the past few decades whenever someone mentioned his past. But there was something in David's eyes, a sincerity and pain that resonated with Pete's own experiences with loss and regret. "I don't know any Miguel Martinez," Pete said slowly, searching his memory for the name. "You wouldn't remember him," David replied quickly. "It was 1985, and he was just nobody special. At least that's what he always said. But what you did for him, Mr. Rose, what you did changed his entire life." Pete leaned back against a stack of 2x4s, his mind racing through the events of 1985. It had been one of his final years as a player-manager, a time when the pressures of chasing Ty Cobb's hit record were mounting and the first whispers about his gambling were beginning to circulate. Those days felt like a blur of games, interviews, and increasingly sleepless nights. 1985 was a long time ago, son, Pete said carefully. A lot happened that year, good things and, well, things I'm not proud of. You're going to have to be more specific. David reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn manila envelope, yellowed with age, and handled so frequently that the edges were soft and frayed. Pete could see that whatever was inside had been precious to someone for a very long time. My father kept this, David said, holding the envelope carefully. Every day for 20 years he carried it with him, in his wallet, in his work bag, on his nightstand when he slept. When he got sick, when the cancer started taking over, he made me promise that someday I'd find you and tell you what it meant to him. The hardware store around them seemed to fade into the background as Pete focused entirely on the young man standing before him. There was something about David's posture, the way he held that envelope like it contained the most valuable thing in the world, that made Pete's throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. What's in there? Pete asked quietly. David opened the envelope with reverent care and pulled out a single piece of paper. Even from a distance, Pete could see that it was old, the paper slightly discolored, and the edges worn smooth from years of handling. As David unfolded it, Pete caught a glimpse of his own signature scrawled across what appeared to be a baseball program. It's from June 15th, 1985, David said, his voice thick with emotion. The Reds were playing the Padres. My father had saved up for months to buy a ticket. It was the first professional baseball game he'd ever attended. Pete's mind began to work backward through time, trying to place that specific date. June 1985 had been crucial in his pursuit of Ty Cobb's record. He'd been just dozens of hits away from making history. Every game had felt monumental, every at-bat scrutinized by reporters and fans alike. He was 26 years old, David continued, working 2 jobs to support my mom and me. I was just 3 at the time. Dad was a janitor at a downtown office building and worked weekends at a car wash. He told me he spent 3 months eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day so he could save enough money for that ticket. Pete felt his chest tighten as David spoke. He'd heard countless stories over the years about fans making sacrifices to attend games, but there was something about the specificity of this account, the peanut butter sandwiches, the 2 jobs, the 3-year-old son, that made it feel intensely personal. The game went into extra innings, David said, his eyes focused on the worn program in his hands. Dad said he was sitting in the cheap seats, way up in the upper deck, but he didn't care. He was just happy to be there, to see you play in person. Pete remembered that game now. It had been a frustrating night, full of missed opportunities and what felt like endless at-bats that didn't result in the hits he desperately needed. The pressure of the record chase had been building for months, and every game without progress felt like a personal failure. After the game, David continued, Dad was walking to his car in the parking lot. He said it was really late, probably close to midnight, and most of the fans had already left. He was tired. He'd had to work a double shift that morning before the game. But he said he was the happiest he'd been in years. Pete found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the story despite himself. There was something about David's telling that made Pete feel like he was there, in that parking lot on that humid Cincinnati night, nearly 4 decades ago. That's when he saw you, David said, looking directly into Pete's eyes now. You were walking to your car, alone, carrying your equipment bag. Dad said you looked exhausted, maybe even a little sad. He almost didn't approach you. He said he figured the last thing you wanted was to be bothered by some nobody asking for an autograph. Pete's throat tightened as fragments of that night began to surface in his memory. He could almost smell the humid Ohio air, feel the weight of another game without a record-breaking hit, the loneliness of walking through an empty parking lot while the weight of expectations pressed down on his shoulders. But something made him change his mind, David continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Dad said he thought about me, about how someday he wanted to tell his son that he'd actually talked to Pete Rose, that he'd met Charlie Hustle himself. So he gathered up his courage and called out to you. Pete closed his eyes for a moment, and suddenly he could see it, a young Latino man in work clothes calling out hesitantly across the darkened parking lot. The memory hit him with surprising clarity, as if it had been waiting all these years to surface. Miguel, Pete said softly, the name coming back to him like a whisper from the past. David's eyes widened in surprise. You remember him? Pete nodded slowly, the memory crystallizing with each passing second. He had on a blue work shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket. He was nervous, kept apologizing for bothering me. Said he had a little boy at home. "No, that was me," David said, his voice barely audible. "I signed his program," Pete continued, the details flooding back now. But he seemed, I don't know, like there was something else he wanted to say. Something more than just getting an autograph. David carefully refolded the program and held it against his chest. "Dad told me that you asked him about his work, about his family. He said most people, famous people, they just sign whatever you put in front of them and move on. But you actually talked to him." Pete remembered now. Miguel had seemed different from the typical autograph seeker. There had been something in his eyes, a weariness that Pete had recognized in his own mirror during those difficult years. Instead of the usual quick signature and polite goodbye, Pete had found himself genuinely curious about this young father who had sacrificed so much for a single night at the ballpark. "He told me about his son," Pete said quietly. "About how he was working 2 jobs to make sure the boy would have opportunities he never had. About how important it was to him that his kid would grow up in America with chances to be whatever he wanted to be." David's eyes filled with tears as Pete spoke. "He said you listened to him for almost 20 minutes in that parking lot. 20 minutes where Pete Rose, one of the greatest players who ever lived, treated a janitor like he mattered." Pete felt his own eyes beginning to burn with unshed tears. He remembered that conversation now, remembered how talking to Miguel had somehow made his own problems feel smaller, more manageable. Here was a man working twice as hard for half the recognition, doing it all for love of his family, and he'd been genuinely grateful just to be heard by someone he admired. "But that's not the part of the story that changed his life," David said, his voice breaking slightly. Pete looked at him with growing curiosity and emotion. "What do you mean?" David took a shaky breath before continuing. "Dad said that when you were getting ready to leave, you stopped and looked at him really seriously. And then you said something that he carried with him every single day for the rest of his life." The hardware store around them seemed to hold its breath as David prepared to share the words that had meant so much to his father. Pete found himself anxious to hear what he'd said all those years ago, words he'd probably spoken without thinking, but that had somehow carried profound meaning for a young immigrant trying to build a better life for his family. "You told him," David said, his voice steady now despite the tears streaming down his face, "that being a good father was more important than any record that could ever be broken. You said that the way he was working to take care of his family, the sacrifices he was making, that made him more of a champion than any trophy or award ever could." Pete felt as though the breath had been knocked out of him. He leaned heavily against the lumber stack, overwhelmed by the weight of words he barely remembered speaking, but that had clearly carried tremendous power for another human being. "And then," David continued, "you shook his hand and told him that his son was lucky to have him as a dad. Dad said he cried the whole drive home that night. Not because he'd met Pete Rose, but because Pete Rose had made him feel like he was enough." The silence stretched between them in the lumber section of Murphy's Hardware. 2 men separated by decades and circumstances, but connected by a moment of genuine human recognition that had rippled through the years to bring them together in this unexpected place. Pete wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring if anyone saw him crying in the middle of a hardware store. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "I had no idea those words meant anything to him." "Mr. Rose," David said, stepping closer, "my father took those words and built his entire life around them. He never missed one of my Little League games, even when he had to work double shifts to make up for the lost time. He taught me to work hard, to be honest, to treat people with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from." Pete listened in amazement as David painted a picture of Miguel Martinez's life. A life apparently shaped in part by their brief encounter in that parking lot so many years ago. "He put me through college," David continued. "I was the first person in our family to graduate from university. I became a teacher, Mr. Rose, elementary school. And every day, when I go to work, I try to see my students the way my father said you saw him that night, like they matter, like their dreams are worth listening to." Pete felt overwhelmed by the ripple effect of what had seemed like such a small gesture at the time. Here was a young man whose entire life had been influenced by a 20-minute conversation in a parking lot, a conversation that Pete had probably forgotten within days. "Your father," Pete said slowly. "What happened to him? You said he died?" David's expression grew solemn. "Pancreatic cancer. It happened fast, 6 months from diagnosis to the end. But even in the hospital, even when he was in pain, he kept that program with him. The nurses said he would show it to everyone who came in his room, doctors, orderlies, other patients. He'd tell them about the night Pete Rose made him feel like a champion. Pete had to lean against the lumberstack more heavily now as the full impact of David's story hit him. Over the past few decades, he'd received countless letters and heard numerous stories about how his baseball career had affected people's lives. But he'd rarely heard about how his simple human interactions had touched someone so profoundly. Before he died, David continued, Dad made me promise two things. First, that I would always remember that being a good man was more important than being a successful man. And second, that someday I would find you and tell you what your kindness meant to him. How did you find me? Pete asked, still processing the magnitude of David's story. David smiled through his tears. It took almost 2 years. I knew you lived in the Cincinnati area, but I didn't want to just show up at your house or bother you at some public event. I wanted to approach you the right way, respectfully. I started coming to places where I thought you might shop, hoping to run into you naturally. This is the 14th hardware store I've visited in the past 6 months. Pete shook his head in amazement. You've been looking for me in hardware stores for 6 months? Dad always said you were a regular guy who probably did regular guy things, David replied with a small laugh. He said celebrities who take the time to really talk to people usually aren't the type to have other people do their shopping for them. The observation struck Pete as remarkably insightful. Miguel had read him well during their brief encounter all those years ago, understanding something fundamental about Pete's character that had guided his son to this moment. David, Pete said, stepping closer to the young man, I want you to know something. These past few years have been hard for me. Really hard. I've made mistakes, big ones, and there are days when I wonder if I did more harm than good during my career. But hearing about your father, knowing that something I said helped shape the kind of man he became, that means more to me than you could possibly understand. David nodded, clearly moved by Pete's sincerity. Dad always said you were going through a difficult time back then. He could see it in your eyes that night. But he also said that the measure of a person isn't whether they have problems, it's how they treat other people when they're struggling themselves. Pete felt a profound shift happening inside him as David spoke. For years, he'd been carrying the weight of his mistakes, the guilt over his gambling, the shame of being excluded from the Hall of Fame. But here was evidence that even during his darkest period, he'd been capable of genuine goodness, of making a positive difference in someone's life. I have something for you, David said, reaching into his jacket again. This time, he pulled out a small photo, black and white and slightly faded with age. Pete could see it showed a young Latino man in work clothes holding a small boy on his shoulders. Both were smiling broadly, and the man was pointing towards something outside the frame of the picture. This was taken the day after you met Dad, David said, handing Pete the photo. Mom took it in our backyard. Dad was telling me all about meeting Charlie Hustle, about how someday I was going to be able to tell my kids that my dad met Pete Rose. I was only 3, so I didn't really understand, but I could see how happy it made him. Pete studied the photo carefully, seeing the joy and pride in Miguel's face, the innocence in young David's eyes. It was a snapshot of a moment in time when hope and happiness had filled this small family, in part because of a conversation in a parking lot. Keep this, Pete said, trying to hand the photo back to David. No, sir, David replied firmly. Dad wanted you to have it. He said someday, when I found you, I should give you this picture so you could see what your kindness looked like in real life. Pete held the photo with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the tangible proof of the impact his words had made. Looking at Miguel's proud face, he could see the reflection of the hope and dignity that their conversation had reinforced in the young father. David, Pete said quietly, I need you to know something. What your father did, raising you, working those jobs, putting you through school, that wasn't because of anything I said, that was because of who he was. I just recognized something that was already there. Maybe, David replied, but Dad said that sometimes people need someone else to see their worth before they can really believe it themselves. You gave him that gift, Mr. Rose. You helped him see that his dreams for me were worth fighting for. As the two men stood together in the lumber section, surrounded by the honest smell of fresh wood and the warm light of the late afternoon, Pete felt something shifting inside him. For the first time in years, he was remembering not what he had lost, but what he had given. Not the records that had been tainted or the honors that had been withheld, but the simple human connections that had somehow managed to transcend his mistakes and touch other lives. Your father sounds like he was an incredible man, Pete said softly. He was, David agreed, and he never forgot that Pete Rose helped him believe he could be. The bell at the front of Murphy's Hardware chimed as other customers entered the store, reminding both men that the world continued to move around them even as they shared this profound moment. But neither seemed ready to let the conversation end. "David," Pete said, would you be willing to tell me more about your father, about the kind of man he became?" David's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. "Mr. Rose, I would be honored to tell you about Miguel Martinez, the man who taught me that champions aren't just the people who win trophies, but the people who make other people feel like winners too." Odile. As Chapter 1 drew to a close, Pete Rose found himself holding a photograph of a man whose life he had inadvertently touched decades ago, while standing face to face with the son who had spent 2 years searching for him just to say thank you. It was the beginning of a conversation that would challenge everything Pete thought he knew about legacy, redemption, and the true meaning of success. The conversation between Pete Rose and David Martinez continued as they found themselves walking slowly through Murphy's Hardware store, neither man ready to end their unexpected encounter. Tom Murphy nodded knowingly as they passed the counter, recognizing the kind of serious conversation that needed time and space to unfold properly. "There's a diner across the street," Pete suggested as they reached the front of the store. "Good coffee, quiet booths. Would you like to continue this conversation somewhere we can sit down?" David's eyes lit up with gratitude. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Rose." 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth at Mel's Diner, 2 cups of black coffee steaming between them. The late afternoon crowd was light, a few truck drivers, some teenagers sharing a plate of fries, an elderly couple reading newspapers over pie. It was the kind of place where conversations could happen without interruption, where the weight of the outside world felt temporarily suspended. Pete carefully placed the photograph of Miguel and young David on the table between them, studying it again in the better light of the diner. "Tell me about your father's journey," he said quietly. "I want to understand the man whose life I apparently touched." David wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, gathering his thoughts. "Dad came to the United States in 1982 when he was 23. He'd grown up in El Salvador, and things were difficult there, not just economically but politically. His own father had been killed when Dad was 16. Pete listened intently, beginning to understand the depth of courage it had taken for a young Miguel Martinez to start over in a new country. He arrived in Cincinnati with literally nothing except the clothes he was wearing and $47 in his pocket, David continued. He didn't speak much English, had no family here, no connections, but he'd heard that America was a place where hard work could change your life. "How did he meet your mother?" Pete asked, genuinely curious about the story unfolding before him. David smiled, the first truly happy expression Pete had seen on his face since their conversation began. "At the car wash where he worked weekends. Mom was a single mother then, working as a nurse's aide at Cincinnati General Hospital. She brought her car in one Saturday, and Dad said she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. But what really caught his attention was that she had a child's car seat in the back, my older sister, Carmen." Pete raised an eyebrows. "You had a sister?" "Have," David corrected with a warm smile. "Carmen's a doctor now, pediatric oncology at Children's Hospital. But back then, she was just a scared 4-year-old whose father had abandoned her and Mom when she was born." The complexity of Miguel Martinez's situation began to dawn on Pete. Not only had he been starting over in a new country, but he'd chosen to take on the responsibility of helping to raise a child who wasn't biologically his own. Dad said he knew from the moment he met Mom that he wanted to build a family with her. But he also knew that meant he was signing up to be a father to Carmen, and eventually to me. He took that responsibility seriously, more seriously than anything he'd ever done in his life. Pete thought about his own complicated relationship with fatherhood, the ways his career and later his personal struggles had sometimes interfered with his ability to be the kind of parent he'd wanted to be. The picture of Miguel working 2 jobs while still making time for Little League games painted a picture of the kind of dedicated father Pete sometimes wished he'd been more consistently. "The night he met you," David continued, "Dad had been in America for 3 years. He was starting to feel like maybe he was getting somewhere. His English was improving. He'd saved enough money to move Mom and Carmen out of a 1-bedroom apartment into a small house, and they'd just found out Mom was pregnant with me." Pete's coffee grew cold as he listened, completely absorbed in the story of a young immigrant's journey toward the American dream. But Dad said he was also scared that night. Scared that he wasn't doing enough, wasn't progressing fast enough. He was working 60 hours a week between his two jobs, but it still felt like they were just scraping by. He worried that he'd brought Mom and Carmen into a situation where they might never really get ahead. Pete remembered the weariness he'd seen in Miguel's eyes that night in the parking lot, the way the young man had seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "When he called out to you in the parking lot," David said, "Dad told me later that he almost lost his nerve. He said he thought, what is Pete Rose going to care about some nobody janitor's problems? But something about the way you looked that night. He said you seemed like you might understand what it felt like to have pressure on your shoulders." Pete winced slightly at the memory of 1985, remembering how the pursuit of Ty Cobb's record had been weighing on him, how every game without progress had felt like a personal failure. But he'd never thought about how that pressure might have made him more relatable to someone else carrying their own heavy load. "What happened after that night?" Pete asked. "How did our conversation change things for him?" David leaned forward, his eyes bright with the memory of stories his father had told him countless times. "Dad said that driving home that night, he kept thinking about what you'd told him, that being a good father was the most important record anyone could set. He realized that he'd been measuring his success by the wrong standards." Pete waited as David organized his thoughts, clearly wanting to get the details right. "Up until that point, Dad had been focused on trying to make enough money to give us things. Better clothes, a bigger house, newer car. But after talking to you, he shifted his focus to giving us himself, his time, his attention, his presence." "How did that change play out practically?" Pete asked. "Well, he kept working the two jobs. He had to support the family. But he started being more intentional about how he spent his free time. Instead of collapsing in front of the TV when he got home, he'd help Carmen with her homework. He'd read to her, ask about her day, make sure she knew she was loved and valued." Pete felt a tightness in his chest as David described the kind of daily attentiveness that he himself had sometimes struggled to maintain during the demanding years of his baseball career. "When I was born 6 months later," David continued, "Dad said he made a promise to himself that I would never doubt that I was wanted and valued. Even when he was exhausted from work, he made time to be present for the important moments." Like little league games," Pete said, remembering David's earlier comment. "Every single one," David confirmed. "Dad would work the night shift at the office building, come home and grab a few hours of sleep, then be at the ballpark by game time. Mom used to joke that he knew the little league schedule better than his work schedule." Pete smiled, picturing a dedicated Miguel Martinez cheering from the stands while fighting exhaustion from a sleepless night of mopping floors and emptying trash cans. "But it wasn't just about showing up," David continued. "Dad made those games into teaching moments. He talked to me about sportsmanship, about respecting opponents, about how the way you handle losing says more about your character than how you handle winning." "Nah, just sounds like he understood baseball on a deeper level than just the game itself," Pete observed. "He did. And he always credited you with helping him see that perspective. Dad said that meeting you taught him that the real champions are the people who use their platform, whether it's being a famous athlete or just being a father, to lift other people up." Pete felt overwhelmed by the implications of David's words. Here was concrete evidence that his brief interaction with Miguel had influenced not just one man's approach to fatherhood, but had shaped the values passed down to the next generation. "What about your sister Carmen?" Pete asked. "How did your father's parenting affect her?" David's face glowed with pride. "Carmen was 8 when I was born, so she was old enough to really understand the difference Dad made in her life. Her biological father had never been involved, never even acknowledged her existence. But from the day Dad married Mom, he treated Carmen like she was his own daughter." "That couldn't have been easy," Pete said, thinking about the challenges of blended families. "Dad never made it seem difficult," David replied. "He used to tell Carmen that family isn't just about blood, it's about choice. He chose to be her father, and that choice was more meaningful than biology because it was made with love and commitment." Pete thought about his own children, the relationships that had been strained by his gambling problems and the controversies that had followed him. The picture of Miguel Martinez choosing to be present and committed painted a stark contrast to some of Pete's own parenting struggles. "Carmen graduated valedictorian of her high school class," David continued. "Full scholarship to Ohio State for pre-med. Dad was so proud at her graduation that he cried through the entire ceremony. He kept saying, 'Look what she accomplished. Look how far she's come.' And now she's a pediatric oncologist, Pete said, still amazed by the trajectory of Miguel's children. At Cincinnati Children's Hospital, David confirmed, she specializes in treating kids from low-income families, a lot of them from immigrant families like ours used to be. She says Dad taught her that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances. Pete shook his head in wonder. So your father's approach to parenting didn't just affect you two. It's affecting the children your sister treats now. Exactly, David said, and it affects my students too. Every day when I walk into my classroom, I try to see each kid the way Dad saw Carmen and me, as someone with unlimited potential who just needs someone to believe in them. The ripple effect of that parking lot conversation in 1985 was becoming clearer to Pete with each detail David shared. A 20-minute talk between a struggling baseball star and an immigrant janitor had somehow influenced the lives of countless children across decades. "Tell me about your father's last days," Pete said gently. "You mentioned he kept the program with him in the hospital." David's expression grew solemn, but there was peace in his eyes as he remembered his father's final weeks. When the cancer got bad, Dad had to stop working. It was the first time in his adult life that he wasn't able to provide for his family, and that was almost harder for him than the physical pain. Pete understood that kind of struggle, the way a man's sense of identity could be tied up in his ability to contribute, to be useful, to maintain his role in his family's life. But even then, David continued, Dad found ways to give. He spent those last months writing letters to Carmen and me, sharing stories about his childhood, his hopes for our futures, lessons he wanted to make sure we remembered. "What kind of lessons?" Pete asked. "Things like the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their job or social status, the value of hard work, but also the importance of working for something bigger than yourself. And always, always the reminder that being a good person was more important than being a successful person." Pete recognized echoes of their parking lot conversation in Miguel's final lessons to his children. Words that Pete had spoken spontaneously, probably without much thought, had been refined and deepened through Miguel's life experience and passed down as core values to the next generation. The program, David said, reaching into his jacket again, became almost like a talisman for Dad during those final weeks. Whenever he felt scared or overwhelmed by the cancer, he'd hold it and remember that night when Pete Rose made him feel like his dreams mattered. David pulled out the worn program once more, handling it with the same reverence Pete had noticed at the hardware store. Dad told the story so many times that some of the nurses started asking to hear it. He'd tell them about meeting his hero, but then he'd always end by saying that the real lesson was that everyone has the power to be someone else's hero if they just take time to really see people and treat them with kindness. Pete felt tears threatening again as he imagined Miguel Martinez, weakened by cancer, but still finding strength in a memory that had sustained him for decades. "What was the last thing he said about that night?" Pete asked quietly. David paused, clearly trying to maintain his composure. 3 days before he died, Dad was pretty weak, but he asked me to promise him that I'd find you someday. He said, "Pete Rose probably doesn't remember me, but I need him to know that his kindness mattered. I need him to know that treating people with respect creates circles that keep spreading outward, touching lives he'll never even know about." Pete had to wipe his eyes with his napkin, no longer caring who might see him crying in the middle of Mel's diner. The weight of Miguel's final message was almost overwhelming, the idea that a simple act of human decency had created expanding circles of positive impact across generations. "And that's why I've been looking for you," David said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Dad made me promise that I would tell you how much that night meant to him and how it changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone he touched afterward." Pete sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what David had shared. A conversation he barely remembered had become the foundation for a family's values, influencing how Miguel raised his children, how Carmen treated her young patients, how David approached his students. "Your father," Pete said finally. "He sounds like he was the kind of man I always hoped to be." "Mr. Rose," David replied gently. "Dad would say that you helped show him how to be that man. Sometimes we all need someone to reflect our better selves back to us." As the afternoon light began to fade outside Mel's diner, Pete Rose found himself thinking not about his betting scandal or his exclusion from the Hall of Fame, but about the unexpected ways that simple human kindness could echo through time. For the first time in years, he was beginning to understand that perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't measured in hits or records, but in moments like these, moments when he had chosen to see and honor the dignity in another person. "David," Pete said, looking directly into the young man's eyes, "meeting you today, hearing about your father. It's changed something in me. Your dad was right about those circles spreading outward. They're still spreading, even now." David smiled. The same warm expression Pete had seen in the photograph of young Miguel Martinez. Dad would be so happy to know that. He always said the best conversations are the ones that leave both people different than they were before. As Chapter 2 came to a close, both men sat quietly in the diner booth, understanding that their unexpected encounter was far from over. There were more stories to share, more connections to explore, and more healing to be done. The ripple effect that had begun in a parking lot in 1985 was continuing to expand, touching new lives and creating new possibilities for redemption and hope. The next morning found Pete Rose sitting at his kitchen table, the photograph of Miguel and young David propped against his coffee mug. Carolyn had left early for her book club, leaving Pete alone with his thoughts and the profound impact of yesterday's encounter at Murphy's Hardware. Sunlight streamed through the windows of their modest Cincinnati home, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like memories given form. Pete had barely slept, his mind racing through decades of interactions with fans, wondering how many other Miguel Martinezes he had encountered without realizing the lasting impact of his words. His phone rang, breaking the morning silence. The caller ID showed David Martinez's number. They had exchanged contact information before parting ways at the diner the previous evening. "Good morning, Mr. Rose." David's voice carried a warmth that had been absent during their emotional conversation yesterday. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," Pete replied, surprised by how genuinely happy he was to hear from the young man again. "I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about our conversation all night." "Actually, that's why I'm calling," David said. "I have something I'd like to share with you, if you're willing. It's about Dad's influence on other people beyond just Carmen and me. I think you'd find it meaningful." Pete felt his heart rate quicken with curiosity. "I'd very much like to hear about it." "There's a community center here in the Westwood neighborhood," David explained. "Dad volunteered there for 15 years, right up until he got sick. They're having a memorial event this afternoon. It's the 3rd anniversary of his passing. Would you consider coming with me?" The invitation caught Pete off guard. In recent years, he'd become increasingly reluctant to attend public events, wary of the mixture of recognition and judgment that typically followed him. But something about David's request felt different, important in a way that transcended his usual concerns about public perception. "Are you sure about this?" Pete asked. "I mean, won't my being there take attention away from honoring your father?" David's laugh was gentle and understanding. "Mr. Rose, Dad spent 15 years telling everyone at that community center about the night he met Pete Rose. Half the people there have heard the story so many times they could recite it from memory. They'd be honored to meet you, and I think you'd be amazed to see what Dad built in that neighborhood." 2 hours later, Pete found himself driving through the Westwood section of Cincinnati, following David's directions to the Martinez Community Center. As he turned onto a tree-lined street filled with modest homes and small businesses, Pete was struck by the obvious sense of community that pervaded the neighborhood. Children played in well-maintained yards, elderly residents sat on front porches greeting passers-by, and small groups of teenagers gathered around a basketball court without any of the tension or trouble that often characterized urban youth activities. The community center itself was a converted warehouse, its brick exterior adorned with a large mural that depicted scenes of family life, education, and community collaboration. Pete could see David's car in the parking lot, along with dozens of others, evidence that Miguel Martinez's memorial was drawing a significant crowd. As Pete approached the entrance, David emerged from the building with a smile of genuine relief and gratitude. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," David admitted as they shook hands. "To be honest, neither was I," Pete replied. "But something about your father's story. I need to understand the full scope of what he accomplished. I need to see these circles you talked about." David led Pete through the front doors into a large, open space that buzzed with activity and conversation. The interior had been transformed from its industrial origins into a warm, welcoming environment filled with comfortable seating areas, educational displays, and artwork created by local residents. But what struck Pete most immediately was the diversity of the crowd. Young and old, representing what appeared to be every ethnicity and economic background imaginable, all gathered together with an ease that spoke of genuine community bonds. "Mr. Martinez," a voice called out, and Pete turned to see a middle-aged African-American woman approaching them with obvious affection. "David, honey, we've been waiting for you." "Mrs. Washington," David replied, embracing the woman warmly. "I'd like you to meet someone. This is Pete Rose." The woman's eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like reverence. "Pete Rose? The Pete Rose? Oh my goodness, Miguel talked about you so much that I feel like I already know you. I'm Dorothy Washington. I run the after-school program here." Pete shook her hand, immediately struck by her warmth and the obvious affection with which she spoke about Miguel. "Mrs. Washington, I'm honored to meet you. David has been telling me about his father's work here." "Work?" Dorothy laughed. "Honey, Miguel didn't just work here, he was the heart of this place. Come on, let me show you around and you'll see what I mean." As Dorothy led them through the center, Pete began to understand the scope of Miguel Martinez's community involvement. The facility housed a food pantry, after-school tutoring programs, job training workshops, senior citizen activities, and even a small library. But more than the programs themselves, Pete was struck by the obvious love and respect with which everyone spoke about Miguel. "See that corner over there?" Dorothy pointed to a comfortable reading area filled with children's books and small chairs. Miguel built those bookshelves himself. Spent 3 weekends here with his tools, making sure every joint was perfect. He said kids deserve to have beautiful spaces to learn in. Pete examined the craftsmanship of the bookshelves, noting the care and attention to detail that had gone into their construction. They weren't fancy, but they were solid and thoughtfully designed, built to last for generations of young readers. "And that kitchen," Dorothy continued, pointing to a modern food preparation area visible through large windows. Miguel organized the fundraising campaign that paid for those appliances. He went to every business in the neighborhood, explaining how important it was for kids to learn cooking skills and for seniors to have access to nutritious meals. "How did he find time for all this?" Pete asked, remembering David's descriptions of Miguel working 2 jobs while raising a family. "That's what made Miguel special," said a new voice behind them. Pete turned to see an elderly Latino man approaching with a walker, his face creased with age, but his eyes bright with intelligence and warmth. He understood that a community is only as strong as the time people are willing to invest in each other. "Mr. Rose," David said, "this is Eduardo Vasquez. He was Dad's mentor when he first started volunteering here." Eduardo extended a weathered hand to Pete with obvious dignity. "Mr. Rose, Miguel told me about meeting you many times. He said you taught him that being famous meant having responsibility to lift others up." Pete felt a familiar tightness in his chest as yet another person reflected back words he had spoken without realizing their potential impact. "I'm afraid I don't remember saying anything that profound," he said honestly. "Perhaps not in those exact words," Eduardo replied with a knowing smile. "But Miguel had a gift for hearing the deeper meaning in what people said. He told me you made him understand that every person has the power to be a leader, whether they're leading a baseball team or leading by example in their own family and community." As they continued touring the center, Pete met person after person whose lives had been touched by Miguel Martinez's community involvement. There was Maria Santos, a single mother who credited Miguel with helping her get her GED and eventually become a certified nursing assistant. There was Robert Chen, a teenager who said Miguel had tutored him in math every Thursday evening for 2 years, helping him earn a scholarship to the University of Cincinnati. There was Helen Murphy, an elderly woman who explained how Miguel had organized weekly grocery runs for seniors who could no longer drive, treating each delivery like a social visit rather than a chore. "The thing about Miguel," Helen told Pete as they sat together in the center's main gathering area, "was that he never made you feel like you were receiving charity. He made you feel like you were part of a family, like helping each other was just what families do." Pete listened to story after story, each one painting a picture of a man who had taken the values he developed as a father and expanded them to encompass an entire community. The ripple effect that had begun with their parking lot conversation had grown into waves of positive change, affecting hundreds of lives. "There's something else I want to show you," David said, as the formal memorial program began to wind down. He led Pete to a quiet corner of the center where a large photo collage hung on the wall. The display contained dozens of pictures spanning Miguel's 15 years of volunteer work, showing him painting walls, serving food, reading to children, teaching job skills workshops, and celebrating various community achievements. But what caught Pete's attention was a small frame in the center of the collage containing the familiar baseball program from 1985, along with a typed card that read, "Miguel Martinez often said that meeting Pete Rose taught him that true champions use their influence to help others succeed. This program reminds us that a moment of kindness can inspire a lifetime of service." Pete stared at the display, overwhelmed by seeing his signature from nearly 4 decades ago, presented as inspiration for decades of community service. The connection between their brief encounter and Miguel's lifelong commitment to helping others was presented as a direct line of cause and effect. "Dad had them put that up about 5 years ago," David explained. He wanted people to understand that everyone has the power to influence others positively, whether they're famous athletes or working parents or community volunteers. He said your example showed him that respect and kindness aren't gifts you give to people. They're recognition of the dignity that already exists in everyone. As the memorial event continued around them, Pete found himself in conversation after conversation with people whose lives had intersected with Miguel Martinez's circle of influence. The patterns were remarkably consistent. Miguel had seen potential in people that they sometimes couldn't see in themselves, had provided practical help when needed, and had always treated everyone with the kind of dignity and respect that made them feel valued and capable. "You know what the most remarkable thing about Miguel was?" asked Carmen Martinez, who had arrived during the afternoon and was now standing beside Pete and David as they watched children playing in the center's recreational area. Pete had been struck by Carmen's poise and warmth, qualities that clearly reflected her father's influence on her development. "What's that?" Pete asked, genuinely curious to hear her perspective on the father who had chosen to raise her as his own. "Dad never talked about sacrifice," Carmen said thoughtfully. "He worked those 2 jobs, spent his weekends here at the center, drove us to every school event and baseball game, helped with homework every night, but he never once made it sound like he was giving anything up. He made it sound like helping people was the most natural thing in the world, like it was something he got to do rather than something he had to do." Indeed, Pete thought about his own relationship with community service and charitable work during his playing career. He'd participated in plenty of events and fundraisers, but it had often felt like obligation rather than opportunity. Miguel's approach seemed to come from a fundamentally different place, genuine love for his community rather than public relations or guilt. "That attitude was infectious," Carmen continued. "When you spent time around Dad, you started to see opportunities to help everywhere. It wasn't because he preached about it or made you feel guilty if you didn't volunteer. It was because his joy in serving others made you want to experience that same joy yourself." "Is that why you went into pediatric oncology?" Pete asked. Carmen nodded. "Partly. Dad always said that children are the future of any community, and that helping kids reach their potential was the most important work anyone could do. When I was choosing my medical specialty, I kept thinking about how Dad had invested in David and me, how he'd changed our trajectory. I wanted to do the same thing for other kids, especially kids facing challenges like serious illness. And now David's a teacher," Pete observed. "Teaching was never really a question for me," David added. "Growing up watching Dad mentor kids here at the center, seeing how much difference one caring adult could make in a young person's life, I knew that's what I wanted to do with my career." Pete looked around the community center, taking in the evidence of Miguel Martinez's lasting impact. Children were being tutored by teenage volunteers who had themselves been helped by Miguel years earlier. Adults who had received job training were now leading workshops for new participants. Seniors who had been isolated before Miguel organized social programs were now actively involved in mentoring younger community members. "This is incredible," Pete said, gesturing toward the bustling activity around them. "Your father created something that's sustaining itself, growing beyond what he could have imagined." "That's what good leadership does," said Eduardo Vasquez, who had joined their conversation. "Miguel understood that the goal isn't to be indispensable. It's to help other people discover their own capacity to lead and serve." As the day progressed and Pete met more community members, he began to understand that Miguel Martinez's legacy wasn't just about individual acts of kindness or even sustained volunteer service. Miguel had somehow managed to create a culture of mutual support and community investment that continued to thrive years after his death. "Mr. Rose," said a young woman who introduced herself as Jessica Torres, "I wanted to thank you for what you said to Mr. Martinez that night in 1985. Pete looked at her with confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. You weren't even born in 1985. Jessica smiled. No, but Mr. Martinez's influence on my family goes back that far. My mother was one of the first kids he tutored here at the center in the early 1990s. He helped her get through high school and encouraged her to go to college. She became a social worker, and she raised my brothers and me with the same values Mr. Martinez had taught her about education and community service. Pete shook his head in amazement as Jessica continued. I'm a nurse now, working in the NICU at Cincinnati Children's Hospital with Dr. Carmen Martinez. My younger brother is studying to be a teacher, inspired by Mr. David. And my youngest brother just graduated from high school with a scholarship to Ohio State, the same scholarship program that Dr. Carmen helps fund through her volunteer work. The interconnectedness of the Martinez family's influence was staggering to Pete. What had begun as a single conversation about fatherhood had spawned multiple generations of teachers, healthcare workers, and community leaders, all connected by shared values and a commitment to lifting others up. Jessica, Pete said slowly, are you telling me that your entire family's career choices were influenced by your mother's relationship with Miguel Martinez? Not just career choices, Jessica replied. Life philosophy. Mr. Martinez taught my mom that education was the key to changing your circumstances, but also that success meant nothing if you didn't use it to help other people succeed too. She passed that on to all of us. Now, as the memorial event drew to a close and the community center began to empty, Pete found himself sitting quietly with David and Carmen in the space where Miguel had spent so much of his free time over the years. I need to ask you both something, Pete said after a long moment of contemplation. Do you really believe that our conversation in that parking lot was the catalyst for all of this? Or would your father have become this kind of community leader anyway? David and Carmen exchanged a look before David answered. We've talked about this question many times over the years. Obviously, we can't know what would have happened in an alternate timeline, but what we do know is that Dad always said that night was a turning point for him. Before meeting you, Carmen added, Dad was focused on working hard and providing for his family. Those are good goals, but they're essentially individual and family-focused. After meeting you, he started thinking about what it meant to be a good citizen, a good community member. He started seeing connections between his own success and the success of the people around him. Pete nodded slowly, beginning to understand the distinction. So it wasn't that I changed who he was, but maybe I helped him see a broader scope for who he could become. Exactly, David said. Dad always said you didn't give him new values. You helped him recognize that the values he already had could be applied on a much larger scale. You made him think about what it meant to be a champion, not just in sports, but in life. As Pete prepared to leave the community center, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of his own legacy. For decades, he'd been focused on what he'd lost: his Hall of Fame eligibility, his reputation, his standing in baseball history. But here was concrete evidence of what he'd given, often without even realizing it. David, Carmen, Pete said as they walked toward the parking lot, I want you to know that meeting you both, learning about your father, seeing this community, it's changed something fundamental in how I think about my life and my impact on other people. Dad would be so happy to hear that, Carmen said with tears in her eyes. He always hoped that someday he'd be able to tell you how much that night meant to him. In a way, he has, Pete replied, looking back at the community center where Miguel Martinez's influence continued to ripple outward into new generations. Through both of you, through this place, through all the lives he touched, he's still telling me. Then, as Chapter 3 concluded, Pete Rose drove home through the Cincinnati streets with a new understanding of how individual moments of kindness could compound over time into legacies far more meaningful than any statistics or records. The weight of his past mistakes hadn't disappeared, but it was now balanced by evidence of his capacity for positive influence, evidence that had been growing and spreading for nearly 4 decades without his knowledge. 3 weeks after meeting David Martinez at Murphy's hardware store, Pete Rose found himself sitting in the same red vinyl booth at Mel's Diner. But this time, he wasn't alone. Across from him sat Father Michael O'Brien, the chaplain at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, who had become acquainted with the Martinez family during Miguel's final illness. Carmen Martinez had arranged the meeting, believing that Father O'Brien's perspective on Miguel's final months would provide Pete with a deeper understanding of how their parking lot conversation had sustained her father through his most difficult period. Mr. Rose, Father O'Brien said as they settled into their seats, Carmen told me about your encounter with David and about your visit to the community center. I have to say, hearing those stories brought back many powerful memories of my conversations with Miguel during his illness. Pete leaned forward, genuinely curious about this priest's perspective on the man whose life had become so important to his own recent transformation. Carmen mentioned that Miguel talked about our meeting even during his final weeks. I'm having trouble understanding how a 20-minute conversation could have sustained someone through something as difficult as terminal cancer. Father O'Brien smiled with the gentle wisdom of someone who had counseled countless families through their darkest hours. Mr. Rose, in my experience, people facing death don't find comfort in grand philosophical concepts or abstract theology. They find comfort in concrete evidence that their lives had meaning, that they made a difference, that they mattered. And our conversation provided that evidence for Miguel, Pete asked. Not the conversation itself, Father O'Brien clarified, but what that conversation led him to build. When Miguel was dying, he wasn't thinking about meeting a famous baseball player. He was thinking about how that meeting had inspired him to become the kind of father, husband, and community member he was proud to have been. The priest paused to sip his coffee before continuing. Miguel told me that night in the parking lot, you said something about being a good father, being the most important record anyone could set. Those words became the foundation for how he measured his own success for the rest of his life. Pete felt the familiar tightness in his chest that seemed to accompany every conversation about Miguel Martinez. I still can't believe those words carried so much weight for him. That's because you're thinking about them as words, Father O'Brien replied. But for Miguel, they weren't just words, they were permission. Permission to stop measuring his worth by external standards and start measuring it by the love and care he provided to his family and community. Permission? Pete asked, not quite understanding. Father O'Brien nodded thoughtfully. Miguel grew up in extreme poverty in El Salvador. His father was killed when he was young. His mother struggled to feed the family, and education was a luxury they couldn't afford. When he came to America, he brought with him a deep sense that he had to prove his worth through material success. Pete began to understand the psychological weight Miguel had been carrying during their 1985 encounter. But that night in the parking lot, Father O'Brien continued, someone he admired, someone who had achieved the kind of success Miguel thought he was supposed to want, told him that his value as a person wasn't measured by fame or money, but by his commitment to his family. It gave him permission to stop chasing someone else's definition of success and start building his own. And that shift is what enabled him to become so involved in community service, Pete asked. Exactly. Once Miguel stopped measuring his worth by external standards, he was free to invest his time and energy in the things that actually mattered to him. His children's education, his wife's happiness, his neighbors' well-being. He could see that being a good man was more valuable than being a wealthy man. Pete thought about his own struggles with external validation, how much of his identity had been tied up in records and recognition, how devastating it had been to lose that validation through his gambling scandal. Father O'Brien, Pete said slowly, I have to admit that I've spent the last few decades focused on what I lost, my reputation, my Hall of Fame eligibility, my place in baseball history. But learning about Miguel's story has made me wonder if I've been measuring my own worth by the wrong standards. The priest smiled with understanding. Mr. Rose, one of the things Miguel talked about during his illness was his concern for you. He'd followed your struggles in the news over the years, and he worried that you were carrying too much guilt and shame about your mistakes. Pete looked up in surprise. He worried about me? I never even knew he existed until 3 weeks ago. Miguel believed that people who have the power to influence others, whether they're athletes, parents, or community leaders, often carry a heavier burden of responsibility than most people realize. He understood that your gambling problems were a sign of pain, not just poor judgment. What did he say about it? Pete asked quietly. Father O'Brien chose his words carefully. Miguel said that the man who took 20 minutes to listen to a stranger's worries in a parking lot was the real Pete Rose. He believed that your gambling problems were a distraction from your true character, not a reflection of it. He hoped that someday you would be able to see yourself the way he saw you that night, as someone capable of profound kindness and positive influence. Pete felt tears threatening as he processed Miguel's perspective on his struggles. For decades, he'd been focused on the ways his gambling had tainted his legacy, but here was someone who had seen past those mistakes to the person underneath. Did Miguel ever consider reaching out to me? Pete asked. During all those years when my problems were in the news? He thought about it many times, Father O'Brien replied, but he was afraid that contacting you might seem presumptuous or self-serving. He didn't want you to think he was trying to use your acquaintance for any kind of personal benefit. Pete shook his head, imagining how different the past few decades might have been if he'd known about Miguel's perspective during his darkest periods. However, Father O'Brien continued, Miguel did do something that might interest you. During the worst years of your public struggles, he organized prayer circles for you at the community center. Prayer circles? Pete asked in amazement. Every Tuesday evening for almost 5 years, Miguel would gather whoever was available. Sometimes it was 3 people, sometimes it was 30, and they would pray for your healing, your peace, and your eventual redemption. He believed that the man who had shown him such kindness deserved support during his difficult times. Pete was speechless. While he had been struggling with addiction, legal problems, and public humiliation, a man he'd forgotten he'd ever met was organizing weekly prayers for his well-being. Miguel never told his children about those prayer circles, Father O'Brien added. I only know about them because he mentioned them during one of our counseling sessions. He said that praying for you helped him remember that everyone makes mistakes and that healing is always possible for people who are willing to do the work. What kind of healing did he pray for? Pete asked. That you would find peace with your past, purpose in your present, and hope for your future. Miguel believed that your story wasn't finished, that there were still opportunities for you to make positive contributions to other people's lives. Pete thought about the past 3 weeks, how meeting David and learning about Miguel's legacy had indeed brought him a sense of peace and purpose he hadn't felt in years. Father O'Brien, Pete said, I need to ask you something. Do you think Miguel would approve of what I'm thinking about doing? What are you thinking about doing? The priest asked with curiosity. Pete took a deep breath before answering. I want to find a way to continue what Miguel started, not necessarily at the community center, but something that honors his memory and carries forward the values he lived by. I want to use whatever influence I still have to help other people the way he helped people. Father O'Brien's face lit up with genuine joy. Mr. Rose, I think Miguel would be absolutely thrilled to know that his story inspired you to think about service to others. But more than that, I think he would say it proves his point about the ripple effects of kindness. What do you mean? Miguel always believed that the conversation you had in 1985 would eventually circle back to benefit you somehow. He said that kindness creates what he called sacred circles. When you help someone, it enables them to help others. And eventually, that chain of helping finds its way back to bless the original giver. Pete considered this concept of sacred circles, thinking about how Miguel's children were now helping others, how the community center continued to serve new generations, how his own recent encounters with the Martinez family had renewed his sense of purpose. What would you suggest I do? Pete asked. I mean, I'm not exactly the most popular public figure these days. I'm not sure how much influence I really have anymore. Father O'Brien leaned forward with enthusiasm. Mr. Rose, you're thinking about influence the wrong way. Miguel's greatest influence didn't come from fame or fortune. It came from treating individual people with dignity and respect. You don't need to be beloved by the general public to make a difference in specific people's lives. Can you give me an example of what that might look like? Well, Father O'Brien said thoughtfully, Miguel used to mentor young fathers at the community center. Men who were struggling with the same challenges he'd faced, working multiple jobs, trying to be present for their children, feeling overwhelmed by responsibilities. What if you started something similar? Pete felt a spark of excitement at the suggestion. You mean like a mentoring program for fathers? Or for anyone who feels like they're carrying too much weight alone? Miguel always said that people don't need someone to solve their problems. They need someone to listen to their struggles and remind them of their own strength and worth. Pete thought about his conversation with Miguel in that parking lot, remembering how the young man had seemed to need exactly that kind of validation and encouragement. The beautiful thing, Father O'Brien continued, is that you already know how to do this. You did it for Miguel without even thinking about it. You saw a hard-working man who was doubting his own worth, and you reminded him that his love for his family made him valuable regardless of external measures of success. But that was just one conversation, Pete protested. I didn't set out to change anyone's life. And that's exactly what made it so powerful, Father O'Brien replied. Miguel told me that what struck him most about that night wasn't that you were trying to be inspiring. It was that you were being genuinely human. You shared your own perspective on what really mattered in life, and that authenticity made your words credible and meaningful. Pete began to envision what a mentoring program might look like, how he might be able to create structured opportunities to have the kind of meaningful conversations with people that he'd accidentally had with Miguel. Would Carmen and David be interested in helping with something like this? Pete asked. I think they'd be honored to help, Father O'Brien replied. In fact, I suspect they've been hoping you'd want to do something like this ever since David first approached you at the hardware store. Why do you say that? Father O'Brien smiled knowingly. Because that's exactly what Miguel would have done if your roles had been reversed. If he'd learned that someone he'd influenced was struggling with guilt and public shame, he would have found a way to help that person channel their experience into service to others. His children learned that approach from watching him for decades. As their conversation continued, Pete felt increasingly energized by the possibility of creating something meaningful from his encounter with the Martinez family. For the first time in years, he was thinking about what he could build rather than what he had lost. Father O'Brien, Pete said as they prepared to leave the diner, if I do decide to start some kind of mentoring or service program, would you be willing to help me think through how to do it right? I don't want to mess this up. Mr. Rose, the priest replied warmly, I would consider it an honor to help you continue Miguel Martinez's legacy. He spent years praying for your redemption. I think helping you find a path forward would be exactly what he would want. As Pete drove home from Mel's diner that evening, he felt a sense of anticipation and purpose that had been absent from his life for decades. The weight of his past mistakes hadn't disappeared, but it was now balanced by the possibility of future service. Miguel Martinez's story had shown him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about allowing the past to inform a more meaningful future. Chapter 4 concluded with Pete Rose finally understanding that his greatest legacy might not be his baseball records or even his mistakes, but his capacity to recognize and affirm the dignity in other people. The conversation that had begun in a hardware store was evolving into a commitment to carry forward the values that Miguel Martinez had lived by. Treating everyone with respect, seeing potential in unexpected places, and understanding that true success is measured by the positive impact we have on other people's lives. 6 months after their initial meeting at Murphy's hardware store, Pete Rose stood before a group of 25 men in the basement meeting room of St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Cincinnati's Westwood neighborhood. The faces looking back at him represented a cross-section of working-class America. Construction workers, truck drivers, factory employees, small business owners, and several young fathers who reminded him powerfully of Miguel Martinez in 1985. The Fathers and Mentors Circle had started as Pete's attempt to honor Miguel's memory by creating structured opportunities for the kind of meaningful conversation that had changed both their lives decades earlier. With guidance from Father O'Brien, support from David and Carmen Martinez, and endorsement from the community center where Miguel had volunteered, the program had grown beyond Pete's initial expectations. Good evening, everyone, Pete said, settling into the folding chair that completed the circle of men. I want to start tonight by reading something that was shared with me recently by David Martinez, whose father, Miguel, was the inspiration for this group. Pete pulled out a worn piece of paper and adjusted his reading glasses. This is from a letter Miguel wrote to his son during his final illness. David thought it would be meaningful for all of us to hear it. Pete cleared his throat and began to read, My dear David, I have learned during my life that every man faces moments when he questions his own worth, when he wonders if his efforts matter, when he feels like he is not enough for the people who depend on him. These moments of doubt are not signs of weakness. They are signs that you care deeply about doing right by the people you love. The measure of a man is not whether he has these doubts, but how he responds to them. Does he allow them to paralyze him, or does he use them to motivate himself to keep growing, keep trying, keep loving? Remember always that being a good father, a good husband, a good friend, a good neighbor, these are the achievements that matter most. Everything else is just decoration. Pete looked up to see several men wiping their eyes, clearly moved by Miguel's words. Miguel Martinez never met most of you, Pete continued, but he understood the struggles you face because they were his struggles too. Working hard to provide for your families, trying to be present for your children despite demanding jobs, wondering if you're doing enough, being enough, becoming the kind of man your family deserves. Pete's own voice caught slightly as he spoke, remembering his conversation with Miguel in the parking lot and thinking about his own journey as a father and husband. "The reason we gather here every week," Pete said, "is because Miguel taught me something important. No man should have to carry his burdens alone. We're here to listen to each other, support each other, and remind each other that the love you show your families and communities makes you valuable regardless of what the rest of the world thinks about your success or failures." The format of the meetings had evolved organically over the 6 months since the program started. Each session began with Pete sharing a story from Miguel's life or reading from his letters, followed by open discussion where men could share their own challenges and receive support from the group. What had surprised Pete most was how eager these hard-working men were to talk about their fears, hopes, and struggles once they felt safe to do so. "Tonight, I'd like to start with Marcus," Pete said, nodding to a young African-American man in work clothes who had been attending meetings for 2 months. "Marcus, last week you were telling us about the challenge of balancing your overtime schedule with your daughter's school activities. How did things go this week?" Marcus shifted in his seat, clearly still getting comfortable with being the center of attention. "Well, Mr. Rose, I took the advice you all gave me about talking to my supervisor. I explained that my daughter has a school play coming up, and I really need to be there. I was nervous about asking, but it turns out he's got kids too. And he was more understanding than I expected." Several men nodded approvingly, and Pete felt the familiar warmth that came from watching people support each other. "That's fantastic, Marcus," said James Rodriguez, a construction foreman who had become one of the group's most active participants. "It takes courage to speak up for your family priorities at work. Your daughter's going to remember that you were there." "That's exactly right," added Robert Chen, the same Robert Chen who had been tutored by Miguel Martinez as a teenager and was now a successful engineer and father himself. "My kids are older now, teenagers, and they still talk about the times I made sure to be present for their important moments. Being there matters more than overtime pay." Pete watched the interaction with deep satisfaction. This was exactly what Miguel would have wanted, men from different backgrounds and circumstances sharing wisdom and encouragement, helping each other become better fathers and community members. "Robert, since you're here tonight, would you mind sharing that story about Mr. Martinez that you told me before our first meeting?" Pete asked. "I think it would be meaningful for the newer members to hear it." Robert nodded, his expression growing warm with memory. "Miguel Martinez tutored me in math when I was 16 years old. I was failing algebra, and my parents were talking about making me repeat the grade. But every Thursday evening for 2 years, Mr. Martinez sat with me in the community center library, working through problem after problem until I understood." Pete had heard this story before, but it never failed to move him. The ripple effects of Miguel's kindness seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. "The thing about Mr. Martinez," Robert continued, "was that he never made me feel stupid or ashamed for struggling with math. He would say, 'Robert, everyone has different strengths. Your job is to work hard enough to turn your challenges into strengths too.' He taught me that intelligence isn't about being naturally good at everything. It's about refusing to give up when things get difficult. And look at you now," said Tom Patterson, a truck driver whose own son was struggling with school. "You're an engineer helping design bridges. Mr. Martinez would be proud to see what his investment in you accomplished." "But here's the thing," Robert replied. "I don't think Mr. Martinez helped me so that I could become successful. I think he helped me so that I could help other people. That's what this group is really about, continuing the circle of men helping men." Pete felt a profound sense of completion as he listened to Robert speak. Here was tangible evidence that Miguel's values were continuing to spread, generation after generation, creating new networks of support and encouragement. "Speaking of continuing the circle," Pete said, "I have an announcement to make. David Martinez has agreed to start co-facilitating these meetings with me." The group erupted in enthusiastic applause as David Martinez entered the meeting room from where he had been waiting in the hallway. Pete had wanted his presence to be a surprise, knowing how much the men in the group had come to respect Miguel's memory and values. "Thank you all for that warm welcome," David said as he took a seat in the circle. "I've been hearing about this group from Mr. Rose for months now, and I'm honored to be invited to help continue my father's work." "David," said Marcus, "your dad sounds like he was an incredible man. I wish I could have met him." David smiled with the warmth that Pete had come to associate with the Martinez family. "Marcus, in a way you are meeting him. Every time someone in this group encourages another man to be present for his children, Every time someone shares wisdom about balancing work and family, every time someone reminds another person of their worth, that's my father's influence continuing to spread. Pete watched as David naturally took his place in the group dynamic, bringing the same combination of humility and wisdom that had characterized Miguel's approach to helping others. "I wanted to share something with all of you," David continued. "Next month marks 4 years since my father passed away. My sister Carmen and I have been planning a memorial celebration at the community center, and we'd like to invite all of you to attend." "We'd be honored to be there," said James Rodriguez, speaking for the group. "But there's something else," David said, glancing at Pete with obvious affection and respect. "Carmen and I have been talking with Mr. Rose about expanding this program. We think Dad's approach to mentoring and community support could help a lot more people than just the men in this room." Pete felt his heartbeat quicken with anticipation. Over the past few months, he and the Martinez siblings had been discussing ways to honor Miguel's memory through broader community service initiatives. "What did you have in mind?" asked Tom Patterson. "Well," Pete said, taking up the explanation, "we're thinking about starting a mentoring network that connects experienced fathers with young men who are just starting their families. We'd also like to create a program that pairs successful professionals with young people who need guidance about education and career planning. Basically," David added, "we want to institutionalize the kind of informal mentoring my father provided for decades. Instead of relying on chance encounters, we want to create structured opportunities for people to help each other." Pete looked around the circle of men, seeing excitement and curiosity in their faces. These were men who had benefited from the support of the group over the past 6 months, and he could see that many of them were eager to extend that same support to others. "The beautiful thing," Pete continued, "is that everyone in this room has something valuable to offer. Whether you've got 20 years of parenting experience or you're just learning how to balance work and family, your struggles and victories can help someone else who's facing similar challenges." "Mr. Rose," said Robert Chen, "you know I'm in. Mr. Martinez changed my life by believing in me when I was a teenager. If there's a chance I can do that for someone else, I want to be involved." One by one, the men around the circle voiced their enthusiasm for expanding their efforts beyond their weekly meetings. Pete was struck by how naturally they embraced the opportunity to serve others, evidence that Miguel's values had indeed taken root in their hearts. "There's one more thing I want to share with all of you," Pete said, as the meeting began to wind down. 6 months ago, when I first had the idea for this group, I thought I was doing it to honor Miguel Martinez's memory. But I've realized that this experience has been just as much about my own healing and redemption." The room grew quiet as Pete prepared to share something he had never discussed publicly before. "Most of you probably know about my gambling problems and the trouble they caused in my life and career. For decades, I've been focused on what I lost because of those mistakes. My Hall of Fame eligibility, my reputation, my place in baseball history. But meeting David and learning about his father's story has helped me understand that redemption isn't about getting back what you lost. It's about discovering what you can give." Pete paused, looking around the circle at men who had become not just participants in a program he'd started, but genuine friends who had enriched his life immeasurably. "Miguel Martinez taught me something through his example that I couldn't learn any other way. That our mistakes don't have to define us, but our response to our mistakes can. I made serious errors in judgment that hurt my family and damaged my reputation. But being here with all of you, seeing how we can support each other and help each other become better men, this has shown me that my story isn't finished yet." "Mr. Rose," said Marcus quietly, "speaking for everyone here, I think we'd say that your mistakes don't matter to us nearly as much as your willingness to help us with ours. You've given us a place where we can be honest about our struggles and get encouragement to keep trying. That's a gift you can't put a price on." The other men nodded in agreement, and Pete felt overwhelmed by their acceptance and support. For the first time in decades, he was experiencing the kind of unconditional positive regard that he had once provided to Miguel Martinez in a parking lot. "All right, everyone," David said as the official meeting time came to an end. "Same time next week. And remember, if anyone needs to talk before then, we've all got each other's contact information. Nobody has to handle their problems alone." As the men began to gather their things and head home to their families, Pete found himself standing with David near the exit, watching the natural camaraderie that had developed among the group members. "David," Pete said quietly, "I need you to know something. When you approached me in that hardware store 6 months ago, I was in a pretty dark place emotionally. Learning about your father's story didn't just inspire me to start this program. It probably saved me from spending the rest of my life drowning in regret and self-pity. David placed a hand on Pete's shoulder. With the same warmth and respect Pete remembered from their first conversation. Mr. Rose, Dad always said that healing usually happens when we stop focusing on our own pain and start focusing on other people's needs. I think what you've created here proves his point. Oof. But I couldn't have created this without the foundation your father built, Pete replied. The values, the approach, the understanding of what people really need, that all came from Miguel's example. Maybe, David said with a smile. But Dad couldn't have built his foundation without the encouragement you gave him in that parking lot in 1985. See how the circle completes itself? As Pete drove home through the familiar Cincinnati streets, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had begun as a chance encounter in a hardware store had evolved into a program that was now helping dozens of men become better fathers, husbands, and community members. The ripple effects that had started with a 20-minute conversation nearly 40 years ago were continuing to spread, touching new lives and creating new possibilities for healing and growth. When he arrived home, Carolyn was waiting for him in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a warm smile. "How was the meeting tonight?" she asked, as she had every week for the past 6 months. "Really good," Pete replied, settling into his chair at the kitchen table where he'd first studied Miguel's photograph 6 months earlier. "David Martinez started co-facilitating with me tonight, and we talked about expanding the program to help more people." Carolyn nodded approvingly. She had been Pete's strongest supporter throughout his journey of discovering Miguel's legacy and finding his own path toward meaningful service. "I'm proud of you, Pete," she said simply. "I can see how much joy this work brings you. You're helping people, but more than that, you're helping yourself heal." Pete reached across the table to take his wife's hand, grateful for her patience and support through all the difficult years that had preceded this period of renewal and purpose. "You know what the strangest part is?" Pete said. "I spent decades thinking that my greatest contribution to the world was my baseball career, the hits, the records, the championship teams. But I'm beginning to think that the most important thing I ever did was take 20 minutes to listen to a worried young father in a parking lot." "Maybe they're both important," Carolyn suggested. "Maybe your baseball career gave you the platform to influence Miguel, and your influence on Miguel is now giving you the opportunity to influence all these other men." Pete considered his wife's perspective, thinking about the interconnectedness of his life's various chapters. His baseball success had made him recognizable to Miguel, but his willingness to be genuinely human in that moment of recognition had created the foundation for everything that followed. "I got a call from Carmen Martinez today," Pete said. "She wanted to thank me for involving David in the mentoring program. She said that helping to continue their father's work has been healing for David too, that it's helped him process his grief and find meaning in Miguel's death." Pete paused, thinking about the complex web of healing and redemption that had emerged from their family's encounter. Carmen also mentioned something interesting. She said the hospital where she works has been getting inquiries from other medical centers about starting similar community outreach programs. Apparently, word is spreading about the holistic approach to community health that Miguel pioneered. "So his influence is still expanding?" Carolyn asked. "It seems like it never stops expanding," Pete replied with wonder. "Every person who gets help becomes someone who can help others. Every life that gets touched becomes a source of touching other lives." Miguel understood something that took me decades to learn, that the best way to create a lasting legacy is to invest in people who will then invest in other people. Bibaim. As Chapter 5 drew toward its conclusion, Pete Rose found himself thinking not about the records he had set or the mistakes he had made, but about the circle of influence that connected him to Miguel Martinez, David Martinez, Carmen Martinez, and all the men who gathered each week in the basement of St. Anthony's Catholic Church. The weight of his past had not disappeared, but it was now balanced by the purpose of his present and the hope of his future. Pete Rose had learned that redemption was not about erasing history, but about allowing history to inform a more meaningful future. Through the unexpected gift of Miguel Martinez's story, he had discovered that his greatest legacy would not be measured in hits or home runs, but in the lives he touched and the circles of kindness he helped to create. The story that had begun with a stranger approaching him in a hardware store had evolved into a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, and the miraculous ways that simple acts of kindness can ripple through time to touch countless lives. In the end, Pete Rose's reaction to being surprised by David Martinez had indeed touched everyone's heart, not just because of his emotional response to learning about Miguel's story, but because of his commitment to honoring that story by creating new opportunities for men to support each other, heal together, and carry forward the values that Miguel Martinez had lived by. The circle was complete, but it was also just beginning. Each week brought new participants to the Fathers and Mentors Circle. Each month brought new opportunities to expand their community service efforts, and each year brought new evidence that the ripple effects of kindness and respect could indeed change the world, one conversation at a time. As Pete Rose settled into bed that night, he carried with him the profound satisfaction of a man who had finally understood that true success is not measured by individual achievements, but by the positive impact we have on other people's lives. Miguel Martinez had taught him that lesson through his own example, and now Pete was committed to teaching it to others through his own. The story ended where it had begun, with the recognition that every person has value, every conversation has potential, and every act of kindness creates circles that can spread outward for generations, touching hearts and changing lives in ways we may never fully understand, but should never underestimate.